Welcome back to Bramble and Bone. I'm KT, and this is the story of the Sodder children, a 30-year nightmare carved into the dark hills of Fayette County, West Virginia. As far as the state of West Virginia was concerned, 5 children had died in an unfortunate accident, their bodies consumed by flames. But as the winter snow began to thaw over the newly turned soil on Route 19, the physical evidence left behind in the surrounding woods was about to prove that the official story wasn't just wrong, it was a cover-up. As the winter snow melted off the Fayette County hills in the spring of 1946, green shoots began to push up through the 5 feet of topsoil George Sodder had bulldozed over the cellar pit. To the outside world, the book was closed. The coroner had signed 5 death certificates. The fire department had blamed faulty wiring, and the town of Fayetteville was moving on. But as the ground thawed, the physical receipts of what actually happened on Christmas Eve began to surface around the perimeter of the property, and every single piece of evidence pointed away from a tragic electrical accident and directly toward cold, calculated, premeditated sabotage. The first piece of hard evidence came from the telephone lines. When a repair technician finally arrived in late December to fix the Sodder family's dead telephone line, he didn't find a wire that had been melted, snapped, or scorched by the heat of the fire. He climbed the wooden utility pole near the edge of Route 19, looked at the connection, and called George over. The line hadn't been touched by flames. It had been cleanly, deliberately severed with a pair of heavy-duty wire clippers. More damning still, the killer hadn't just cut the wire at the ground level where a passerby might snag it. They had climbed the 14 feet up the utility pole, in the freezing dark, sliced through the main trunk line bringing service to the house, and left the cut ends dangling in the wind. That was why Jenny couldn't make an emergency call, why Marion couldn't get an operator, and why the alarm had to be carried into town by hand. The house's lifeline had been severed before the first match was ever struck. Next came the mystery of the missing extension ladder. George Sodder was a meticulous man. His 50-foot aluminum extension ladder was an essential tool for his business and property maintenance, and it was always kept bolted to the high exterior wall on the north side of the house. On the night of the fire, when George ran to grab it to reach his children's second-story windows, the wall was bare. Months later, a local farmer walking through a heavily wooded ravine 2 miles down Route 19 stumbled onto something hidden in a deep drainage ditch. Covered under a thick weave of dead pine needles and brush was George Sodder's missing extension ladder. Someone had physically unbolted it from the side of the house, in the dark, carried a heavy 50-foot piece of metal down the road, and concealed it in a ditch so George couldn't use it to reach the attic bedrooms. Then came the mechanical autopsies on George's commercial trucks. When a local mechanic finally towed George's 2 heavy flatbeds off the driveway and into a repair shop, he popped the hoods to find out why the 2 well-maintained industrial vehicles had suddenly suffered simultaneous ignition failures in the middle of the night. What he found wasn't a dead battery or cold fuel lines. The ignition wires on both trucks had been violently yanked from their housings, and the timing coils had been deliberately tampered with and disconnected. It was a mechanical impossibility for 2 separate commercial vehicles, parked side by side, to independently suffer identical, human-inflicted ignition sabotages on the same exact night, by chance. Someone had crept into the driveway, under the cover of darkness, opened the hoods, and disabled George's only means of reaching those second-story windows. And then there was the rubber object. In the late spring of 1946, Jenny Sodder was raking the tall grass near the tree line where she had heard that sharp, heavy thud on the roof at 1 a.m., just minutes before the house filled with smoke. As her rake pulled back the overgrown brush, the metal tines struck a heavy, dark object embedded in the turf. Jenny reached down and pulled out a small, hollow, dark rubber casing. It was charred on one side, heavily weighted, and shaped like a thick cylinder. George took the object to a visiting military officer and ammunitions expert stationed nearby. The officer took one look at the rubber casing, turned it over in his hand, and identified it immediately. It was an incendiary rubber bomb casing, a device used during World War II, designed to be thrown onto rooftop shingles, where it would ignite, melt down into white-hot liquid fire, and burn through timber roofs in minutes. The thud Jenny heard at 1 a.m. wasn't falling ice or a snapping tree branch. It was an explosive, incendiary device landing directly above their sleeping heads. Every single piece of physical infrastructure around the Sodder home, the phone lines, the escape ladders, the rescue vehicles, the roof above the master bedroom, had been systematically targeted and neutralized before the fire started. Yet local law enforcement refused to reopen the case. Fayette County Sheriff A.S. Haynes and the local prosecutors maintained that there was no proof of foul play, sticking rigidly to the official narrative that the children had died in an accidental electrical fire. By 1949, 4 years after the blaze, George and Jenny were desperate. They hired private investigators, contacted the FBI, and began digging into the backgrounds of local officials. And that was when rumors began to circulate about Fire Chief F.J. Morris. A local minister, burdened by what he had been told in confidence, came forward to George Sodder with a staggering revelation. He confessed that Fire Chief Morris had admitted something appalling during a private conversation on the morning of the fire. Chief Morris had actually found remains in the basement ash. According to the minister, Morris claimed he had dug up a piece of charred human flesh, what looked like a small, calcified human heart. But instead of turning it over to the coroner, the county sheriff, or a medical pathologist, Morris had secretly sealed the organ inside a small metal army surplus box and buried it in a shallow hole right on the Sodder property. George Sodder was stunned, furious, and consumed by a terrifying hope. If a heart had been found, it meant at least one of the children had perished in the flames. But why would the fire chief bury physical evidence instead of documenting it? In August of 1949, George Sodder assembled a team. He brought in private investigators, local laborers, and a respected Washington, D.C. pathologist named Dr. Oscar B. Hunter. Together, they marched onto the Sodder property, confronted Fire Chief Morris, and demanded he lead them to the exact spot where he had buried the metal box. Under pressure and facing potential obstruction charges, Morris walked over to the spot near the garden wall, pointed to the dirt, and picked up a shovel. After digging down just 2 feet, the shovel struck metal. They pulled out a small, rusted tin box, wiped off the damp earth, and pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a dark, dried, preserved mass of organ tissue. Chief Morris stood back, claiming his conscience was clear. There was the proof that a child had died in the blaze. Dr. Hunter packed the box into a secure container and flew it directly back to his laboratory in Washington, D.C. for formal medical analysis. A week later, Dr. Hunter's pathology report arrived in the mail. His findings shattered Chief Morris's story to pieces. Dr. Hunter's laboratory analysis revealed that the tissue inside the box was not a human heart. It was a piece of beef liver. Furthermore, the liver had never been exposed to high heat or fire. It had been clean cut with a butcher knife, buried in the ground long after the fire had burned out, and had completely decomposed at a normal rate. It was assumed that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had gone to a local butcher shop, bought a piece of raw beef liver, placed it in a metal box, and buried it on the Sodder property. He had faked a human organ recovery in a desperate, corrupt attempt to convince George and Jenny that their children had died in the fire, hoping they would finally stop asking questions. The revelation proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the official investigation was compromised from the top down. The fire chief just wasn't incompetent. He was actively planting fake evidence to close a case involving 5 missing children. If the chief of police and the fire chief were willing to plant animal organs to forge a death record, who were they protecting? What powerful force in Fayette County was capable of orchestrating a multi-tiered sabotage, cutting phone lines, stealing ladders, disabling vehicles, throwing bombs, and coercing local officials into a cover-up? George and Jenny Sodder realized that the authorities were never going to help them. If they wanted to find Maurice, Martha, Louise, Jenny, and Betty, they were going to have to launch a war of their own. A war that would play out across a massive, haunting billboard along U.S. Route 19. By 1952, George and Jenny Sodder knew that if their children were ever going to be brought home, it wasn't going to come from a police investigation or a court order. The authorities had washed their hands of the Sodder family, hiding behind 5 rushed death certificates and a story about an electrical short that science had already disproved. So George and Jenny decided to turn the site of their greatest tragedy into a massive, unavoidable beacon of truth. On the exact spot where their home had stood, right along the shoulder of US 19, they erected a massive timber frame billboard. Painted in bold, high contrast lettering across the top was a simple, piercing question. What was the fate of the Sodder children? Beneath the headline were 5 black and white photographs. 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louise, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. Below their faces, George posted a $10,000 cash reward for any information leading to the recovery of his children. For over 30 years, that billboard became a legendary, dark staple of Appalachian highway travel. Millions of tourists, long-haul truckers, and local residents drove past those 5 young faces staring out over the West Virginia mountains. It stood as a permanent, silent accusation against the town of Fayetteville and a promise that 2 parents would never stop searching. And as the billboard gained national attention, the tips began to roll in. Some were dead ends born of small-town gossip, but several eyewitness reports were so detailed, so specific, that they chilled George and Jenny to the bone. Shortly after the fire, a woman in Charleston, West Virginia, about 50 miles west of Fayetteville, reported seeing 5 young children matching the Sodders' exact descriptions, riding in a large sedan with several adults of Italian descent. She said the children were being held in a hotel downtown and that the adults seemed secretive and defensive whenever anyone approached. A waitress at a roadside diner in Florida claimed she served breakfast to the 5 children just days after Christmas 1945, noting that they were accompanied by 2 adult men and an adult woman who spoke fluent Italian amongst themselves. Another woman running a hotel in Columbia, South Carolina, filed a sworn affidavit stating that a group of adults had checked into her establishment with 5 children shortly after the fire. When the woman had tried to speak to the children in the hallway, one of the adult men snapped at her in Italian, pulled the children into the room, and locked the door. The next morning, before sunrise, the entire group was gone. The pieces began to form a terrifying picture. Was this an organized kidnapping? Was it retaliation by fascist loyalists targeting George's anti-Mussolini rants, snatching his children and smuggling them out of state, or even out of the country back to Italy? Could it have been an operation connected to the black market adoption rings that had plagued the American South in the 1940s, where children were stolen from target families, given forged birth certificates, and sold to wealthy, childless couples across state lines. If the children had been snatched before or during the initial outbreak of the fire, it explained everything. It explained the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and why not a single bone fragment was found in the cellar ash. The fire wasn't intended to kill the children. The fire was set to cover up a mass abduction. Then, in 1968, 3 years after the fire, a letter arrived in the mail that would change everything. It was addressed directly to Jenny Sodder. The envelope bore a postmark from Central City, Kentucky, but had no return address. Jenny opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single black and white photograph of a young man in his late 20s. He had dark, intense eyes, thick, wavy hair, and a strong, prominent jawline, a facial structure virtually identical to 9-year-old Louis Sodder. Jenny turned the photograph over. Written on the back in dark blue ink was a cryptic, handwritten message. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. The family was stunned. The facial alignment was undeniable. The young man in the photo looked like a grown version of their missing 9-year-old son. Desperate for answers, George and Jenny pooled their savings and hired a private investigator to travel to Central City, Kentucky, and track down the young man in the photograph. The investigator took the Sodders family's money, packed his bags, and headed for Kentucky. He never came back. He never called the Sodder home. He never submitted a written report. He never cashed another check. And when George tried to reach him, the investigator had completely vanished. Whether he was paid off, threatened, or met a darker fate, he took whatever secrets he found in Kentucky straight to his grave. The heartbreaking weight of 24 years of dead ends, corruption, and unanswered questions finally broke George Sodder's physical heart. In 1969, 1 year after the Kentucky photograph arrived, George passed away at the age of 74, dying without learning what became of his 5 missing children. Jenny Sodder didn't give up. After George died, she built a high brick wall around the side of her former home, enclosing the garden where the cellar pit used to be. She put on black mourning clothes in 1945 and wore black every single day for the rest of her life, for 44 straight years until her own death in 1989. Jenny spent her final days sitting on the porch along Route 19, watching the cars pass by the billboard, waiting for a child to pull up the driveway. Until her last breath, she refused to accept that her children had died in that fire. She knew what any mother knows, and what thermal science confirms: bones do not vanish into thin air. After Jenny's death, the billboard was finally taken down, its wooden post rotting after decades in the West Virginia soil. But the search did not end with George and Jenny. Sylvia Sodder, the baby who was carried out of the burning master bedroom as a 2-year-old on Christmas Eve, spent her entire adult life managing the family's investigative files, giving interviews, and pushing law enforcement to re-examine the physical evidence. Sylvia carried the torch for her parents until her own passing in 2021. Today, her children, George and Jenny's grandchildren, continue to maintain the case files and monitor tips. 8 years have passed since the night of December 25, 1945. The house on Route 19 is gone. The billboard is gone. The parents, the fire chief, the sheriff, and the investigators are all resting in the soil of Fayette County. But the facts of File 004 remain absolute, written into the physical reality of the universe. Phone lines do not cleanly cut themselves 14 feet up a pole. 50-foot ladders do not walk 2 miles into a drainage ditch on their own. 2 commercial engines do not simultaneously experience identical human-inflicted timing coil failures by coincidence. And a 45-minute house fire does not incinerate 5 human skeletons into total non-existence while leaving kitchen coal stoves full of unburned bone. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, whether they perished in the dark or lived out their lives under assumed names in distant states, their vanishing remains one of the most haunting, deeply unsettling, unsolved mysteries in American history. The file on the Sodder children remains open. Thank you for stepping into the archive with us tonight. Until next time, I'm KT. Lock your doors, check your tree lines, and keep your lamps burning bright. This is Bramble and Bone.